Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this new webinar from the International Energy Agency. Today, we will discuss energy modeling in the framework of our capacity reinforcement program for Sub-Saharan Africa for energy data and energy modeling. I'm very pleased to be with you. Today to start this new week dedicated to energy modeling. Today we will discuss hydrocarbons supply, the hydrocarbons topic, and the supply of energy in our simplified chart of the entire energy system. Where last week we discussed end-use sector demand, taking the illustration with the building sector. Then we discussed transformation and the power sector. And today we are going more upstream, if I may say, in our chart with the supply of primary energy, even though we'll discuss also a bit transformation with refinery and how to go from crude oil to final oil products, for example. So this is for today. Tomorrow and on Thursday, please note that Wednesday there will be no webinar. These will be sessions animated by academic partners, Imperial College and Politecnico di Milano, on energy modeling as well. As previously, if you have any question, please raise your hand or use the Q&A box or send us email as needed. So to start, I'd just like to share with you what will be discussed today. So we will enter a bit into how do we define price of oil, for example, price of fossil fuels when we do energy modeling and when we make projections on how the future of the energy system might evolve. So there is all a question on what will be the price for energy in the future, and this relies on demand supply iteration. Then we will present how the model for fossil fuel supply is structured. It has module, it has sub-modules. We'll enter into that. Then there will be more of economical consideration with NPV, net present value calculation, production profiles, and investment for each oil field, for example. We'll do a break and take some questions. And in the second part of the training, we'll discuss refinery and a very key topic, which is sustainability for the fossil fuel and on the oil and gas industry. Before we start, I'd like to invite you to answer a few ice-breaking questions on www.menti.com. So I will share in a second the code. So for today's series of questions, the code is 57814514. And the first question we'd like to ask you is, when we do supply modeling, so trying to make projections on the future of the supply of energy, what do you think are the key parameters to take into account? And we are proposing 5 of them: prices, resources, reserves, demand, and project profitability. Okay, so I see some first questions. Demand and resources rate very high. You're also considering project profitability and prices. Well, as always, there is no one good answer and there is no bad answer. All those parameters are key. If we were to keep some, um, we could maybe take prices and resources, but of course, other parameters are key to make those one. As we said, prices can result from demand, so it's obviously an underlying very important parameter. But yeah, prices, resources, demand, and project profitability, all of them are very key. Okay, next question on a topic that has been very discussed in the energy world over the past decades is the peak in global oil production. So according to you, are we close to reaching such a peak? Shall we reach it very soon or not soon at all? And I know it's not very accurate. I could have put a number of years to make it quantitative. Soon or not soon is pretty vague, but it will give us an idea of what do you think about this concept of a peak in oil production. Okay, so it looks like it's quite in the middle, although it might be rather sooner than later. Um, what we can say, well, no one has the answer. Again, we don't have crystal ball to predict the future, but well, oil is a physical resource limited, so it production cannot be endless. There will be a decrease at some point, so there will be a peak. This is just mathematical. The question is when, and the question maybe also more interesting is what will produce what will cause this peak? Will it be a limitation in available resources, or will it be a decline and a peak in oil demand? And this is a question which many people are working on, considering that given climate consideration, we know that oil is a very emitting energy. So if we want to limit global warming and to reduce CO2 and greenhouse gases emissions, we need to peak our consumption of oil. So regardless of the availability of the resource, we would need sooner than later to peak the global oil production and consumption. Okay, one last question. Yeah, connecting to this idea of a sustainable development scenario, so a trajectory which will be aligned with our climate goals and the Paris Agreement. Do you think that in such a world, such a trajectory, we will still need oil? So again, you're quite in the middle. We'll again we at the IEA we are making projections on what will be the demand for oil if we want to be consistent with our targets to reduce CO2 emissions. So we are working very hard on seeing how we can reduce CO2 emissions and then how we can reduce the use of fossil fuels. There will be a new report in 3 weeks with net zero trajectories. So how can we reach net zero CO2 emissions by 2050? looking at consumption of all fuels and needs for services in all the sectors. How can the transport work with less oil or without oil? So we are really working on it. In the very short term, there is still a need for oil because that's really a key energy for transports mainly, and also increasingly for petrochemicals as a chemistry entrant. So if we don't change the way we consume plastic, it will be very difficult to reduce the consumption of oil on the, to yeah, to meet such needs. Thanks for your answer. I'm stopping here for the Menti question and coming back to the presentation. So before today, my colleague Rebecca, who is a fossil fuel modeler and analyst with very strong expertise on the oil and gas industry, she will join for presenting some really the mechanics of fossil fuel modeling. Before that, I just like to share a few findings and set the scene on oil and gas in Africa more specifically, with a couple of slides. So first, let's have a look at which countries in Africa are the main oil producers and consumers. So on this map, you can see in dark blue the OPEC members, and you will see the top oil producers countries with Nigeria, Angola, but also Algeria, Libya in Northern Africa, and in the Guinea basin, we also have Congo, Gabon, and Equatorial Guinea. A few important crude oil producers are not part of OPEC, like Egypt, Sudan, and Ghana. So this is production. When we look at consumption, without much surprise, we will see that the main consumers are the more developed economies of the continent, with North Africa, Northern African countries, with South Africa. If we look at oil demand per capita indicator, number one will be Mauritius. Other countries with relatively small population like Gabon, Namibia, Botswana would also rank very high. And we will have also some key countries like Nigeria, of course, or Kenya, with a high oil consumption in the country. So this was oil and consumption only. Now, if we look at a few indicators of where Africa stands in the global situation. So here you can see with a few indicators the share of Africa in oil global supply, trade, demand, and refinery. And you would see that Africa accounts for less than around 8% of the supply, 10% of the trade. But then when it comes to demand or to refinery production, Africa stands for 3% of the global. And this was in 2018. If we look at how things evolved over time, over the last 2 decades, so on the left part, you will have the first decade of the century, and on the right part, you would have the decade since 2010. Demand in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, has not evolved much. We are around half a million barrels per day. But then what the difference, excuse me, sorry, this chart is about the change between the year 2010 and 2000 on the left, and the change between the year 2018 and 2010 on the right. So for demand, there has been a similar increase, so a consistent growth over time. But for production, we can see that in the first decade, production had increased significantly with key producers like Nigeria, Angola, and other countries of the continent. Whereas since over the last 10 years, production has declined, and as a result, exports that were positive in the first decade of the century are now negative, meaning that Africa is importing more oil than it's exporting. Now let's look at discoveries and resources. So here you can see on the left oil and on the right natural gas, and this is a global picture of the discoveries happening every year. So Africa is in sub-Saharan Africa is in red, with North Africa in blue, and what you can see is that for oil, the share of the continent is between say 5 and 25% of the global discoveries. But for natural gas, there have been really very important discoveries in the continent, meaning that if we take this average between 2011 and 2018, Africa has accounted for 40% of discoveries for natural gas. And this comes from many different parts of the continent, Tanzania and Mozambique, but also looking west, Senegal and Mauritania, Egypt, more recently South Africa. So it's really coming from different parts of the continent, and we think that Africa is at a turning point for natural gas, with the opportunity to become a major producer and exporter, but also to use this resource locally for electricity generation and also for industry. So natural gas really expected to play a strong role in the coming years and decades in the continent. So this was discoveries. If we try to look at what the future could be made of in terms of production, this is the outlook we worked on 2 years ago at the IEA, and we expect oil production to remain stable by 2040, with some countries taking a higher share, like Libya, and some countries stabilizing at their current level, like Algeria or Angola. Um, but when we look at natural gas, again, it could be a very different story, with a more than doubling of the production by 2040 compared to today's level, with the ramping up of Egypt and really the coming of Mozambique, Tanzania, and other countries bringing their very strong natural gas production in the coming years. So in terms, if we try to have a comprehensive view of the oil sector, so here you can see in yellow oil production, which is the same as what we just discussed previously. But in orange, you would see oil demand, and this is the final end-use demand for transport, of course, with all the different modes. It can be cars, buses, trucks, passenger, but also goods transportation. It can be also aviation. It can be shipping and boats. So all the energy needs and needs for services in transport sector, but there is also demand for oil in industry. There is also demand for oil for electricity generation in some countries. There is also a demand for oil in the residential sector, with households using kerosene for lighting or sometimes for cooking, or with households or with small companies using backup generator using diesel. So oil is really consumed in all the subsectors, and we expect demand to double by the end of the year 2040 compared to today's level. Production in the continent so will remain stable, but demand is expected to double. When we look at the local refinery activity, so how to come from crude oil to end-use products like gasoline, like diesel, we also expect some increase, a doubling of the activity, but which is not enough to cope with the local demand. So this would mean that imports of oil products is also expected to increase in the continent. And these are always the different ways of looking at this oil topic, looking at crude oil production, looking at refinery activities, and looking at demand for final products, with trade and imports being able to balance if there is no match between production and demand locally. One more slide on what does that mean for countries, for governments who have oil and gas resources, and what does that mean for their income. So on this chart, we have looked at the top 10 producers of oil and gas in Africa, and we have looked at their net income, the money they get from exporting their resources. And what we can see is that there has been a lot of variation of those income. And if we look at how government expenditure evolved, it's always rising when the income are increasing, but when there are some drops, it's harder for governments to decline very sharply their expenditure. So this is due to volatility of price. This is due to evolution in production, but this creates some very tense and difficult situation for countries who mostly or only rely on their hydrocarbons resources. So there is a need for diversification of the economies to make the most of those sources of income, but also to have more robust and diversified sources of revenues. And this is very true in the future, where according to our stated policy scenario, we don't expect incomes to come back to the highest years that we saw over the past years. And in another scenario where there would be faster energy transitions, we would expect oil demand to decrease, and then competition for getting oil would be higher, and it's possible that for African countries with such resources, it will be even higher to get more incomes because of more competition, because of lower prices, for example. And here again, discussing competition between the different oil and gas producers, what we observe is that the world is increasingly going for small size projects with very short time to market periods. So between the time you find the resource and the time you are able to produce the first barrel of oils, we see that there is a trend to have a very short time to market. So to have projects which are developed very quickly, to have projects which have shorter cycle, and these are the type of projects that investors are prioritizing. So if Africa wants to really make the most of its resources, African governments really need to be competitive in that sense too. So I'm stopping here with those first findings and information on the oil and gas sector in general. And now we'll come back to more of the modeling part. How do we make such predictions? How do we put into a model the supply of oil and gas production? So I will give the floor to my colleague Rebecca to present to you more into details how this works.
Hello and welcome to this subsection as we talk through supply modeling, and specifically fossil fuel supply modeling in the IEA's World Energy Supply Model. In the course of this first section, we're going to detail more information and background on the prices and demand supply iterations that we go through in the model. We'll step through first, taking a look at the current picture of the oil and gas industry today. And what you see here is a view of the ownership of oil and gas, both the proven plus probable reserves, the production, and the upstream investment by company type from 2018. On the left-hand side, we see oil, and the right-hand side, we see gas. And this is broken apart by the industry landscape for oil and gas, and it's typically characterized into the majors, producers like Shell, Total, Eni, BP, ExxonMobil, and others, independents, companies like Tullow, the North American shale independents, including Oxy and EOG, and also national oil companies that are split between both independent NOCs and NOCs that are more closely tied to their states. Fossil fuels still can provide an opportunity for energy access under the right conditions. However, increasing attention and import is being paid to reducing emissions across the sector. NOCs on the whole account for well over half of global production and an even larger share of future and existing reserves. As we take a look at the view of remaining technical recoverable resources for both oil and gas, we'll step through the picture of gas first. Currently, we have about slightly less than 20% of total resources have been produced to date. With oil. And oil is broken apart into conventional, extra heavy oil and bitumen, tight oil, NGLs, or natural gas liquids, and kerogen oil. On gas, much of gas is on the conventional side. Overall, we've consumed less than 20% of the oil and gas that's estimated to be developable. Significant sources and resources still remain, particularly in conventional and extra heavy oil or bitumen. And gas resources, previously thought as a waste stream many decades ago, have grown to be considered a potentially important transition fuel as we look forward to clean energy transitions. Shown here is the resource breakout for both oil and gas. And overall, there's not a question of whether there are resources to develop. The question that we're going to dive into in this slide and future slides as we go through the course of this module is at what cost and what does future demand look like, and how the balances of those two factors play into global supply. So we'll explore this in much of the discussion, but first turn to the question of emissions from oil and gas operations. Fossil fuels can provide an opportunity for energy access under the right conditions. However, increasing importance and attention is being paid to reducing emissions across the sector. In 2020, we've seen many countries, including China, Japan, and Korea, make net zero carbon emission pledges. The IEA has analyzed emissions from oil and natural gas, including a recently updated methane tracker, which shows country and regional breakouts of the primary emission pathways. For oil and natural gas production, most emissions from operations are caused by the release of methane to the atmosphere. Methane on a 100-year lifetime has approximately a 30 times greater warming potential than carbon dioxide. And we estimate, based on our analysis, that more than 70% of these methane emissions could be abated at no net cost to the operator, or essentially could be captured and sold on as methane in the existing operations. A long-time area of focus, flaring has received even greater scrutiny and attention in the last few years. In 2019, about 150 BCM of gas was flared, or more gas than is currently used by the entire continent of Africa. Flaring of associated gas occurs sometimes in the event of an emergency or a non-standard operational event. However, most flaring occurs due to the lack of a gas market or infrastructure built directly to the operation site. Recent geospatial analysis by many individuals and highlighted by the IEA indicates that more than half of flaring occurs within 20 kilometers of existing gas pipelines. Further, if flares were unlit or operating in poor conditions, even more emissions than are currently estimated may be released. We're going to step into next the IEA's World Energy Model and an overview of the supply model. As we turn to the supply model, we consider what must be taken into account in order to assess supply. Some of these key elements in the module include demand across the sectors, price, available resources, and the cost to produce those resources, or essentially the economic viability of the projects. Government policies in particular have a hand in driving demand for a product stream as they help to drive customers and consumers or help to set future CO2 pricing, for example. The price may be sufficiently stimulating to bring in new investments into a sector, and the price and supply are intricately linked and depend on resources, production costs, and overall policies. In the world energy model, we assess a price scenario that maintains a relatively static path forward. In reality, prices fluctuate, and sometimes significantly. The world energy model assesses supply of fossil fuels, including coal, oil, and natural gas, as well as traditional and modern biomass. Demand is first assessed by sector and country and region, and global supply is then modeled. Import and export needs are assessed in the model, and trade is defined based on these demand needs and global excess. Typical models in the IEA World Energy 3 fossil fuel supply modules for oil, natural gas, and coal. Oil and natural gas are linked as many reservoirs contain heavier components and result in the production of natural gas liquids, or NGLs. These NGLs are incorporated then into the overall oil supply model. Oil, as a global commodity, is treated globally, such that supply and demand are in balance. And natural gas and coal seek equilibrium in the model on a regional basis and are considered with regional demand and trade infrastructure constraints, and then the supply is equilibrated. Price iterations that we'll dive into in subsequent sections are needed to ensure that the price assumptions that are inputted into the model reflect sufficient return on investment. In the model itself, we're going to look and explore more several of the different types of oil that are modeled, as well as several of the different types of gas that are modeled. In the next section, we'll talk a bit more on both these details. First, a word on price trajectories. The World Energy Model takes international fossil fuel prices and the future pathways and trajectories and reflects the levels needed for sufficient investment in supply to meet demand. Prices are derived through iterative modeling, and their trajectories, while they appear smooth, in reality are much more likely to be volatile. The cost of supply by type of resource, location, and including technology learning curves varies for both oil and gas. This also considers how the relative risk of investment changes depending on country or region. The price of oil or gas must be sufficiently high to encourage investments in supply to meet demand. Shown here, you can see the different price outlooks that were used in the World Energy Outlook in 2019. For the current policy scenario, in this scenario, in light of the COVID pandemic, was not utilized in our WEO 2020. It had reflected essentially a business case as usual that is not as applicable in the current environment. It shows the stated policy scenario or steps that reflect a pathway that takes into account all currently stated policies from governments and industry insofar as they are sufficiently detailed and robust to have a likely probability to be achieved. And then also the sustainable development scenario. In this scenario, the SDS works backwards from the energy-related United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to achieve universal energy access for all, improve public health outcomes, achieves a net zero emission by 2070 with about a 50% chance of limiting a temperature rise to 1.65 degrees. You can see the variations in oil price that are used and needed in each one of these scenarios. And while oil price varies widely, and to show the smooth trajectories here, they do reflect the different ways in which resources, costs, and policies all affect the supply-demand balance. In this next section, we're going to dive deeper into the fossil fuel supply module, its structure, and its submodules. Here, we detail the project resolution in the World Energy Model, specifically in the oil supply module. In the WEM oil supply module, there are 10 distinct types of oil, some of which have finer detail than others. In the crude and enhanced oil recovery sections, or subsections, we detail further the onshore, shallow, deep, and ultra deep. Other categories, such as the Arctic, extra heavy oil and bitumen, kerogen, tight oil, all have varying distance, technology, or depth categories. Coal to liquids, gas to liquids, and additives are assessed as well if sufficient price warrants. Overall, in comparison to the electricity module, the oil module is more flexible than that of electricity, but the structure that we've seen is quite similar. When we look ahead to gas, at first blush, the gas supply module appears more simplified. Currently, we're working to break apart the modules into more discrete subsectors similar to the oil module. The conventional gas module is broken apart into gas and Arctic gas, as well as unconventional gas, including tight gas, coal bed methane, shale gas, coal to gas, and hydrates. The overall structure of the module, and we're going to highlight this on the oil supply module. It first fundamentally looks at global demand. The key inputs into the module, such as historical production levels, recently sanctioned projects, remaining technical recoverable resources, costs, including finding and development, lifting costs, or our OPEX, fiscal tax regimes, discount rates, and decline rates all help to govern what remaining or excess demand needs to be covered. The module is an equilibrium model and will assess what further supply is needed based on the excess demand and project economics. It works the economic calculations based on what you've seen in the preceding 2 slides, and it ranks those projects according to NPV. Then it brings on these new resources according to that ranking, subject to any logistical or resource constraints. This loop is then repeated for all regions and all oil types or all gas types. Moving from the basics of the demand and supply model, we're going to also dovetail and talk more on the NPV calculations and the investment portion of the model. When we think about replicating investment decisions in the oil and gas industry, we take a similar approach as what happens in industry in the module itself and in the model itself. We look at the net present value calculation at a project level, and then scale that up on both a regional and a global basis for oil and gas supply. Both the supply and investment modules are our economic models. We treat investment as the level of capital that is spent to develop or maintain assets. Net present value calculations are the basis of the model, as the model assesses the economic reward or loss of producing a set of resources. Let's first look at the variations in the economic model inputs by country and by region and also globally. Prices are assessed, as we spoke earlier on the oil side, with a global price. Gases see a different price regionally or by country depending on scarcity and cost to transport. Countries have a different tax treatment regime, and we track those at the agency and team levels. Additionally, we assess the cost of capital per country and region and per resource type. This translates into an assessment of the investment risk in a country or region. Additionally, as we take a look at resources, we have different costs of supply that govern the outputs of the net present value calculation. And these are done based on the sub-modules and the subsectors in oil and gas that we saw in some of the preceding slides. The cost to produce these are impacted by learning, technology learning, by depletion, and also by inflation, which is in turn impacted by prices. Resource availability and trading and other constraints are also accounted for in the model as the model considers which projects to pick and select to develop in order to meet excess demand and build a view of global supply for oil and gas. Once the model has picked which projects to take forward, it then produces and makes the production profiles according to standards that we have set within the module itself, based on country and region, and also by access type or resource type. The resources selected for production are taken according to the standard profiles. These profiles are set up by reservoir type, extraction method, technology, and location. And shown here, we look at some examples from deepwater US, pre-salt deepwater Brazil, and you can see the differences there based on historical time to invest, develop, and bring on initial production. And then also an example of bitumen mining from Canada, which you can see takes some time to invest and begin production, but then has quite a slow and long plateau. These outputs are what define the production side in the supply module. Natural gas is facing a potential turning point in Africa. In North Africa, gas already meets around half of the region's energy needs. But in sub-Saharan Africa, it has thus far been a niche fuel. The share of gas in the energy mix is around 5%, or among the lowest in the world. Today, Africa accounts for about 4% of global gas demand and about 6% of global production. There are nevertheless several reasons to believe that the future of natural gas in Africa may be different from the past. In recent years, there have been a series of major discoveries in almost every part of the continent, notably in Egypt, in the Saharan adjacent fields, in East Africa, in Mozambique, in Tanzania, West Africa, in Senegal and Mauritania, and also South Africa. Between 2011 and 2018, Africa accounted for more than 40% of global gas discoveries. Together with LNG technology innovation, these developments could fit well with Africa's push for industrial growth and its need for reliable electricity supply. In the power sector, the rapid deployment of renewables leaves room for gas to grow as a flexible and dispatchable source of electricity. Outside the power sector, the successful industrialization rests upon the stable provision of energy, including for energy uses that are hard to electrify. So gas could be quite well suited to some of these needs. Much, however, will depend upon the pricing at which gas becomes available, the development of distribution networks, including small-scale LNG production, and the financing available for infrastructure. In our projections, Africa becomes a major player in natural gas as a producer, a consumer, and as an exporter. Today, Africa as a whole exports a similar volume of gas as Australia, and the continent's gas demand is similar to the combined demand of Japan and Korea. Production declines are the key determinant for future investment needs. Here, we see the historical global oil demand going up to 2018. So we're just shy of 100 million barrels. Moving to the future, if we just invest in current supply, if we do not further invest and just look at the declines from existing fields, you can see that there's still significant oil supply going out into the future for the next 2 decades. If we invest only in fields or only in existing fields, so essentially brownfield production, then we can see that with a fairly minimal amount of investment, oil production still will be maintained quite significantly through the 2020s and the 2030s. To look at the needs in the sustainable development scenario, we can see global oil demand emphasized by the top of the green line here in the sustainable development scenario. We can see that there's still a significant amount of investment that's needed in order to meet demand, even in a more sustainable scenario. If we take a look at the stated policy scenario, there's significantly more investment as well that's needed to both maintain the level of oil demand that we have seen or project to see potentially in the next 2 decades.
Okay, so now let's have a first break for some questions and answers. I can already see some of them, and for others, please feel free to raise your hand again or to ask using the Q&A box. So one practical question, which is apart from the recordings, is it possible to have a script for each presentation? So what we have shared and will share is the presentation themselves. The today's session, as every other, is video recording and available on YouTube. What we will do as soon as the training is closed is to send more material and to mail them directly to Zambia. So we will send maybe USB keys with all the videos and all materials so that it can be shared across the different departments and amongst the colleagues interested. But really, for the script of each presentation, I know it's more the teachers commenting the slides, so it's not super easy to share something for that. Another question that was under hydrocarbons, what do you mean by stated policies? So I'm not sure if this was specific to a specific slide, maybe to that one. Generally, stated policies is the name of one of our scenario, which he's projecting existing, which is based on announced policies by the government, which is based on the known and expected developments of technologies. So this scenario is really, to make it super simple, we could say it's a business as usual scenario, taking into account what we know that could happen in the future, holding up a mirror to policymakers, saying, okay, based on what you have taken as decision, this is where we would go. And usually we have this scenario as opposed to sustainable development scenario or Africa case or net zero scenario, where we do a different exercise where we say if we want by 2050 to have reached those goals, for example, in the Africa case, if we want to have universal access to electricity and clean cooking by 2030, if we want to have economic development as it was defined and ambitioned by the African countries under the Africa Union, the 2063 agenda, if we want to reduce air pollution and meet climate goals, this is where we shall be by 2050, 2030, and this thereby is the trajectory to follow. So it's a different type of scenario as we have for Africa case or sustainable development scenario. I hope this answers, but please feel free to ask other questions or to specify more. While you might write down some other questions, I just wanted also to show you something else. Maybe some of you have attended our monthly Africa IEA University. So every month we have an online webinar where we present a specific report, specific findings, or we invite key partners. And we have all of them also recorded on YouTube. And in the month of April and the beginning of the month, we had one IE Africa University on a recent report that our colleagues from the oil department just released, and it was the market annual report. So here you can see, and I can share later on, the playlist on YouTube with all the reports and presentation we have given. And if you want to learn more on the one on oil, we had a colleague who is really expert in those topics, who presented its report with how the global situation is to evolve in the coming 5 years, and how does Africa stand in their projections. And he's really looking at all at demand from industry, from petrochemicals, on production evolution from OPEC countries and non-OPEC countries, African and non-African. So you will find much more details looking at this webinar if you are interested to learn more on this topic. So I share again the link to that, but that was just a teaser if you are interested in such topics. Okay, I don't see other questions, so I have some for you. So I invite you to go back to the website Menti, and under the same code, we will have a new question. So it's still the same code, but if you just joined us, I share again. It's 57814514. And the next question I'd like to ask you is more a question about statistics. That was something discussed with my colleague Zakia and other colleagues over the past weeks, and it relates to the refining model. So the question is, when measuring inputs and outputs to a refinery, can we expect to have gains? So outputs which are higher than inputs. Okay, so interestingly enough, most of you think it's not possible to have output higher than input. So the answer is it depends, but it depends, and it needs to, the question needs to be more accurate. If we measure in terms of energy terms, the answer is no. We cannot create more energy than what we had as input. So if the refinery receives 1 ton of oil, of crude oil, it cannot if it receives some crude oil, and let's say one kilojoule equivalent of whatever unit, it cannot create more than 1 kilojoule equivalent of oil products like diesel, kerosene, or gasoline. So in terms of energy terms, output cannot be higher than input, but in terms of volume, it's possible with the refining process to have more liters of oil products than the liters of crude oil input products we had at the beginning of the process. So to summarize, in volumes, yes, it's possible. In energy terms, no, of course, we cannot create more energy than what we had as input. So thank you for your answers. Another more open question is about a topic we'll discuss in the next subsection, which is about sustainability. As we all know, the oil and gas sector is responsible for a very important share of global greenhouse gases emissions. Um, so there is a need to make the industry more sustainable and to find solution to put itself on a trajectory aligned with climate agreement. But what do you think the industry can do concretely? Okay, so we have interesting answers on efficiency. to be improved all across the value chain. Also, recovery plans and value addition to waste. So this is also maybe about making more of the resources, improving technologies, looking at byproducts and ensuring that production is as efficient as possible. Okay, interesting. You're mentioning carbon capture to ensure that the process itself is less emitting, non-combustible uses. Someone is mentioning sustainable investment. I'd be interested to understand more what you have in mind when you say sustainable investment. But well, all are very, very good good answers. Efficiency is indeed maybe the first thing to look at. Then when we say efficiency, as you may remember from Zakia and her colleague lesson, there are different ways of approaching it. It can be making more with the same, or we can also look at, in absolute terms, reducing the total activity of fossil fuel supply industry to meet our climate goals. Okay, we'll bring also some answers on specific topics the IEA is looking at, especially on the methane, on tracking methane emissions, which are something that have not been so much tracked over the past, but methane is responsible for a lot of, is a very strong warming gas with a very strong warming potential. So many things need to be done to improve on the how we limit methane emissions. This is one example we will discuss, but yeah, all your suggestions are very good. And I think the supply industry has is in a very challenging situation, but has no other choice to be part of the answer to our climate challenge, and to find together all the solutions to limit emissions from fossil fuels. So thank you for your answers. And we'll come back to the presentation.
In the next section, we're going to detail and step through the refinery module in a finer detail. In the refining model, we look at the key link between oil demand and supply. The module itself is broken up into 4 steps. We're going to detail some of these further in the next slide. First, on project oil demand, we carry 8 categories. And we also look at refined products demand, the overall project refinery runs, and then from these, we calculate a regional trade balance for both crude oil and for oil products. On the right-hand side, you see what we typically output for the World Energy Investment, looking at the refining capacity and runs by region, and in this case, from 2019's new policy scenario. First, on the oil products demand. We assess oil demand for each sector in a region from the demand modules and from those that we looked at earlier. Those are broken down for each oil product. So for ethane, naphtha, kerosene, fuel oil, LPG, gasoline, diesel, and also for other side products. There are some exceptions built within the categories, and those are for LPG, gasoline, and diesel, where we do some calculations outside and bring into the model based on different ways that some of these products are made. These are all worked and based on historical shares and also on some additional modeling that is needed in order to assess what are currently in marine bunkers and future projections for that. Diesel, gasoline, and LPG demand are worked in the road transport module and then transferred and put back into the refining module. LPG demand itself is also assessed in residential cooking and is determined by the access model. Project refined products demand takes a look further into the refinery runs, and those are modeled to meet projected demand for refined products at each product level. The refined products demand equals the refinery runs plus any processing gains. We show here the detail for total liquids, and within this, we have a buildup based on biofuels, total oil, broken apart into CTL, GTL, but also the direct use of crude oil, overall oil products, and then finally refinery products. Project refining capacity is built and assessed for 112 countries in the World Energy Model. This is built into and split into the crude distillation units and also the condensate splitters. All of these take a look at the model product yields and meet projected oil products demand on a global and also then a regional basis. Determined refinery runs or utilizations are based on regional cost competitiveness and also on product trade balances. These are pulled together, and we also take a look at the refining capacity at risk, or essentially what level of capacity may not be needed to meet current and future supply. These are taken into a regional trade balance for all of the crude oil and oil products. And we look at the trade matrices of these and how trade can move between these different regions. The crude oil, or the refinable liquid side, looks at the crude and condensate supply. It takes this, it subtracts off the refinery intake, subtracts off the direct use of crude, and that equals the net import and export requirements. Oil products, on the other hand, look at the refinery output. They include product output from NGL, or natural gas liquid fractionation plants, subtract the oil products demand, and this looks at net import and export requirements. And these are done on a regional basis to come up with an assessment of the overall global crude oil market and also the product markets. The demand for oil products has shifted over the last several decades. The past challenge for refiners has been reducing from the bottom of the barrel. However, when we look at future demand, the challenge becomes more to increasing yields from the top of the barrel products, particularly as we look at product demands that are being pulled and used for the petrochemicals industry and for the plastics industries. In the last section of this module, we're going to take a look at the implications for sustainability in the oil and gas sector, and particularly on climate sustainability. If operated to reduce emissions, oil and gas could be an important source of energy for much of Africa and could enable Africa to take a more significant global role in oil and gas production. Increasingly, as more governments have announced carbon reduction ambitions, including China, Korea, Japan, the EU, the question of emissions, intensity of supply, and imports becomes even more important. The emissions intensity of the oil supply curve is shown here. We take a look at the estimated Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions for the overall crude oil, condensate, and natural gas liquid production from 2018. And as we look at this, and we look at the emissions intensity of this oil supply curve, we see that emissions from operations, including flaring and methane release, as well as emissions from transport and refining, contribute to the overall Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions from operations and transport. From this, we can also see that a relatively narrow band of production contributes an inordinately large proportion of emissions, as you look from about 85 million barrels a day and above. Extracting oil, processing it, and bringing it to consumers is an important component of global greenhouse are between 10 to 30% of the full life cycle emissions intensity of oil. And turning the picture to natural gas The same applies to natural gas. With natural gas, methane leaks to the atmosphere are by far the largest source of emissions on the journey from reservoir to consumer. Increasing attention by governments and non-government agencies have shined a light, in particular, on methane emissions. The uptick in aerial surveillance, including satellite surveillance, has helped to understand where many of the larger leaks are sourcing from. Work by the Environmental Defense Fund and several other parties has also indicated that poor flaring combustion efficiency may be a major source of methane leaks, particularly from the oil sector. These considerations, also in light of the increasing number of country ambitions to reduce carbon emissions, puts into question the need and the importance of addressing emissions in new and existing operations. Looking forward to the future, it may be the case that lower emission oil and gas may be a preferred opportunity in the global market. When we look at overall Scope 1 and 2 emissions intensity of oil and natural gas production in the Sustainable Development scenario, we can see that methane is the #1 source of potential emission reduction and abatement. The IEA estimates that about 70% of methane can be abated at no net cost. The use of CCUS, or carbon capture, use and storage, and renewables can also help to reduce or offset emissions. Additionally, energy efficiency improvements have played a role in recent years to reduce emissions and improve efficiency and costs of oil and gas operations. Oil and gas operations on the whole account for over 4.3 million tons of CO2 equivalent released today, so nearly 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. A large part of these emissions can be brought down relatively quickly and easily. The future is increasingly electric. However, liquids and gas still comprise over 50% of energy consumption to 2040. This also includes a role for low carbon liquids and gases, including some biofuels and hydrogen as well. When we look in the stated policy scenario towards the end of the 2030s, we see about $1 trillion invested in liquids and gases. That's reduced in the and increasing need for low carbon liquids and gases. Overall, as we step towards the end of this module, we're going to leave you with the following conclusions. First, modeling fossil fuel supply requires information and assumptions on reserves and resources, technologies, production profiles, costs, tax regimes, many of the parameters for the NPV calculations, and including refinery, in order to assess a full supply model. Prices are needed to balance supply and demand and help to ensure that new investment is pulled into the sector. But as we model the prices, we need an iterative approach, and real pricing may be much more volatile than the ones that we project and use in our modeling. New projects are needed to come online to offset declining production, and this is needed in both more sustainable scenarios, such as the Sustainable Development scenario, and also increasingly then in the stated policy scenario. Detail on primary and secondary products depend on the model requirements. The evolution of infrastructure can play a very significant role in this regard. And today, about 15% of global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions come from the process of getting oil and gas out of the ground and to consumers. Minimizing these emissions should be a first-order priority for all companies and countries. No oil and gas company will be unaffected in clean energy transitions. So every part of the industry, including national oil companies, need to consider how to respond.
Okay, so I hope this section also provided some answers to what we discussed with the Menti question on sustainability, and also provided more insights on the refining model. So you have received a small Excel exercise on this supply side of the modeling. I like to present very briefly the results and to answer any question you would have on it. And in around 10 minutes, Rebecca will come back with us to answer any question you might have. So she's really the expert on the oil and gas industry and on how we do modeling for fossil fuel supply. So please take the opportunity of her presence to ask any question you would have. So coming to the Excel exercise. Okay, so I hope you can see my screen. I will zoom in a bit. So here the exercise we were asking you um, was putting you in a position to analyze the oil upstream and midstream sector, imagining that the Ministry of Energy wants to anticipate future developments of production, of refining, and also of trade. For demand, here we expect that the demand for final oil products would come from other modeling exercises, from other models, other Excel sheets of your model. As we have discussed, we would have done estimation on at the building level how the demand for kerosene, for diesel would evolve, how for transport, likewise, we would be able to make projections on how the demand for gasoline, for example, would evolve, and this would be inputs to our model here. On once we know this demand, we need to work on how supply will match it. So you were given we are in a country where there is production of crude oil. So you were given historical levels of crude oil production, but this country is also equipped with refineries, and we have a refinery capacity, we have refinery outputs, so how much gasoline is made out of the refineries. We assume that all the crude oil in the country is directed to the refineries, but this is not enough to match demand. So there are also imports of crude oil that go to the refineries to make gasoline, and there is also imports of gasoline to be able to meet all the demand of gasoline. Let's imagine just for the transport sector. So the first question you were asked is, as we always do, before being able to make predictions and to look at the future, we need to understand better historical data. And the first question was to calculate the crude oil inputs to refineries, knowing that the losses of refineries were at a level of 5%. So here it's basically a calculation of knowing that we know the output of the refinery. We know that there is a 5% loss between the input and the output. So we can deduct using those two parameters what the inputs were. And this is an interesting information because we will be able to deduct many other parameters. Question number 2 was to calculate the capacity factor of refineries. So capacity factor or level at which those refineries have been used over this period. We know the capacity of the refinery, but it's expressed in kilobarrel per day, and we know the refinery output. So it's just a question of making the good conversion, and you were given the conversion factor So this is basically what we just did. And from the output and the capacity, we are able to calculate the capacity factor. Okay, I see someone raising a hand, so I will give you the floor so that you can ask. It's Mr. Raymond, your way. You should be able to talk, Raymond. Hi, Mr. Raymond. Can you hear me? Can you speak? Hello. Okay, it looks we have a technical issue. I'm sorry. Maybe if you can ask your question on the Q&A box, then I would be very happy to try to address it. Okay, so after those two questions, we know what has been the crude oil inputs to refineries and what has been the refinery capacity factor. Based on some of those parameters, we'll try to make some projections. And on question number 3, the idea was to make several calculations and to be able to compute the imports of oil in the country and to deduct oil dependency. As we said, the country is importing both crude oil, which goes to the refineries, and also importing gasoline, so an end oil product. So we'll make projections for those two products, and for that we need to take assumptions. So for imports of gasoline, you were given assumptions on the capacity of refineries, how they will evolve in the future, the capacity factor of those refineries, and the hypothesis here was to reach a 70% capacity factor or refinery by the end of the period. And as a consequence, knowing the refinery capacity and capacity factor, we were able to deduct what the output of refineries would be. So we know how much gasoline is produced from our refineries, and we also know, this was given, what is the total demand in the future for gasoline. So whatever is not produced by our refineries, we need to import it so we can deduct imports of gasoline. For imports of crude oil, likewise, we were given hypothesis on the refinery losses, so we can deduct what the input of crude oil in the refineries were. So this could enable us to calculate what production of crude oil, production of crude oil, we were given the hypothesis that it would grow at a 5% rate per year. So as we know, this local domestic crude oil production and the total quantity of crude oil entering into our refineries, whatever is not coming from the national domestic production needs to be imported, so we can deduct it. And we can sum both the imports of crude oil and of gasoline to have the total oil imports and be able to calculate the import dependency, which is the sum of which is what the total imports divided by the total refinery inputs plus the oil demand. Question number 4 was, now that we have more understanding of the we have worked on the midstream part, the refineries. Question number 4 was really about the crude oil production, and here this relates to what was presented by Rebecca on the production profile. So when we have a field, you would know that the production profile, the production is to evolve in a certain way over time, and these were the production profile that you were given under all those lines, looking at what percentage of the total field is produced year after year. And based on what we were given as the production of our production from the year 2018, we would be able to deduct what needs to be added if we want to match the difference with our hypothesis on what the future crude oil production would be. And based on those production profile percentages, we can deduct the total annual crude oil capacity and its ventilation year after year. So I'm stopping here and okay, and looking at the questions, and so I see that someone cannot hear the presentation. If this is the case for others, please really raise your hand. And if it's just an issue at your end, Mr. Raymond, I hope you will be able to solve it. And I see that my colleague Rebecca has joined us. So if you have questions for Rebecca. Hi, good morning, Rebecca.
Hi, good morning.
How are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Good, thank you. We are having a very interesting time with our colleagues from Zambia, mostly from Zambia, but also some energy experts from a few neighboring countries. So we have discussed all the presentation, and I'm just closing the exercise. So I'd like to give the floor to all of you, dear participants. If you have any question, any request for clarification on what Rebecca presented in the video, on what was presented at the beginning or at the Excel exercise, we have some time now to address any question. And again, if you want to raise your hand and to speak up, you are very most welcome to do it.
And I see Raymond has his hand up, so I don't know if that's an old hand or a new hand.
Now, I think it's an old one, and Mr. Raymond apparently cannot hear the presentation. But if you confirm me, Rebecca, that you can hear me well, I think that should be okay. Okay, perfect.
I can. Well, while we're waiting for a few questions to come on regarding fuel supply, and I'll just say on the overall fuel supply and modeling view going forward, just a few things to keep in mind with regards to supply itself. Is one of the key things that we always look at are the decline factors associated with the field, so that we understand how quickly or how slowly the existing fields will be declining, so we understand how much new production we would need to be looking at bringing in domestically, if that's an opportunity, or via importing. And then on the refining side as well, really understanding the efficiencies that we have on the refining side, so that we see how much in terms of losses we have as we go through the system itself. And as you're thinking of a few questions, then we can also discuss and think about some of the upcoming work that the IEA has coming out really just in the next couple of weeks. It's been a very, very busy time for us, and we've been working on several reports. I can give you a little bit of background on that, some of which touch on fuel supply, but many others that also take a look more and focus on clean energy technologies and the ability to finance and pull those into global markets, but also some focus on emerging economies as well. This Wednesday, on May 5th, we will be launching our critical minerals report, and it's the first of its kind that's coming from the International Energy Agency. And we're very excited about that because the report expands our view on what we view as energy security. And it starts to look more in depth at both the demand, but also the supply and value chains that we have in several of our renewable technologies. And it's a new report. I strongly encourage you to drop onto the IEA website and log on for the initial presentation and overview that the team will be giving on Wednesday. We start to dive in and take a look in depth at what mineral supply looks like from some of the more traditional minerals like copper, but also then looking at lithium and cobalt and chromium and other minerals that are quite important and influential on the future of supply for renewable technologies. So that's coming up just this week. And then additionally, we've had a group that I've also been supporting that's been looking at both investments, but finance as well. On the investment side, in 2020 with the pandemic, we saw on the oil and gas side about a 1/3 drop in spending. However, on renewables, we actually saw a slight uptick in 2020. And so we've been working hard over the last few months to try to understand what this is going to look like in 2021 as we start to pick up and come out of the pandemic. But also, we've been taking a very, very in-depth look on clean energy transitions in emerging economies. And so we have an extensive finance report that is going to be coming out the first week of June. We're going to be releasing the investment numbers, I believe June 2nd is the current plan, and then a look on the financing for clean energy transitions on June 8th. And that we're doing in conjunction with the World Bank as well, and with several other global entities. So that will be quite exciting for us as well. And I think the big report that we have coming out also in the near term is our focus, and what we're saying is the world's first, and the IEA's first net zero emissions by 2050 roadmap. And that's the first time that we're really taking an in-depth look at what it would take for the world and to really move to net zero emissions in the 2050s. And so that's going to be released on May 18th. It is a huge amount of work that the team has been doing and pulling together over the last few weeks, or sorry, over the last few months, I should say, working quite feverishly and really combining what the new technologies, existing technologies and new technologies that would have to be fast-tracked and how they're going to need to be moved quickly, and to see how that's going to fit a scenario that would get us to net zero emissions in 2050. That's going to be released on May 18th. Again, I strongly encourage you to take a look at the IEA website and to join us, and also to pose some questions in that you have, perhaps specifically coming from the areas that, whether Zambia or some of the nearby countries that have been able to join today, because it's quite important for us to be able to understand the perspectives of what you're seeing on the ground, and also be able to meet that with some of the visions and goals that we have.
Thanks, Rebecca, for presenting this work. I'm sure the one on mineral would be of the interest of Zambian colleagues and others from Southern Africa, which is, as we all know, a region very rich of minerals, copper for Zambia and others, of course. So stay tuned, and we might also have a dedicated webinar for this report with our African audience in the coming weeks.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah, to discuss more, I think, all the specific findings for Africa and implications of this report. Maybe before we move to a question, and I see one which might interest you. You just mentioned a bit of the net zero report. Without disclosing anything, could you just present us a bit how the team has been working on looking how sectors like transport or other end-use sector, very much relying on oil, can try to adopt this trajectory for net zero emissions to 2050?
On oil specifically, or oil and gas?
Yeah, or oil and gas.
The trajectory is, you look to even to 2030 in a scenario where globally you meet net zero emissions in the 2050s. Oil particularly takes a very, very quick and steep downward trajectory, even to 2030. So you're starting to see, and I won't quote exact numbers, but it's something of on the order between 30 and 50%, and we'll see where the final numbers end up on the 18th, of global demand really starting to decrease quite rapidly. And that starts to come out of areas of a very fast paced transition to electric vehicles globally and e-mobility. But also in the past decade, that transition has been coming. We've been seeing that coming, but also the uptick that we've been projecting in demand for plastics, that also starts to decrease very rapidly as well. And so oil in particular takes a very, very quick and heavy hit. There's a question on how realistic is that, of course, and I think that's an area that the Net Zero report dives into of the challenges that it would take to get to a global move that quickly. Natural gas is quite interesting because in some ways it really is, or has historically been considered part of a clean energy transition in many areas, as it provides a cleaner alternative to coal, and firm baseload power in many areas as well. And so natural gas does not decline as quickly, and it does continue for the next couple of decades. But ultimately, also natural gas as well is phased out in lieu of battery storage and other opportunities for more firm and flexible power with the increase in renewables as well. And Arno, I see there's two questions that have come up from Martin and Yanda. I don't know if you noticed those.
Yeah, the one on Martin mostly relates to the. I can answer it very quickly. So we'd be very pleased to have more time on looking at the Excel exercise. I will send today all the solutions of the different Excel exercises you have seen. Of course, under our online and webinar format, it's not very easy to work all together in an Excel file, but would be, if you want to do the exercises on your side and to send them to us for correction, if you have any question, we are more than happy to take the time. And then we also look forward to be all together in Lusaka and to really do more of practical work, entering into the Excel files and bringing hands-on to such exercises. But for now, I'm sorry, we cannot do much more. But again, any question you have, please feel free to send per email, and we'll be happy to take a deep look and to work with you on those exercises.
Yeah, that'd be a pleasure. And did you touch on Yanda's question?
No, please go ahead with that one, please.
Okay, that's great. So Yanda's question is on the supply side, saying there's been an increase in production from unconventional methods such as fracking. So indeed, most of the growth in oil production over the last decade has come from light tight oil, particularly out of the US, or almost exclusively out of the United States, with some contributions from Canada as well. And Yanda's question is on the methane leakage associated with fracking and unconventional type of production and operations compared to more conventional sources of oil and gas. And over the last few years, we've been able to get quite a bit more insight into the level of methane leakage that's occurred globally. And if you haven't seen it, I would point you to an updated piece of work on methane that my colleagues Thomas and Christophe McGlade have, Thomas Buridiol and Christophe McGlade put out in January of this year. So there's an updated methane tracker there. We work and we have several bridges across to companies that do aerial surveying. And so over the past few years, we've been pulling together our methane tracking globally associated with those companies and understanding the impact of methane and where those sources are coming from. In particular, we see that there's quite a bit of methane that comes from these super emitters. And some of these super emitters are more of the conventional sources of oil and gas. And occur in not always in the same place, but there are a few, let's say, a few super emitters that have occurred continuously over time. Now, it becomes with the aerial surveying a bit difficult to sometimes speak apart because the aerial surveys need a minimum amount of methane leakage in order to be picked up. And particularly with satellites and some of the airborne studies as well, or some of the more, let's say, airplane-derived or drone-derived methane leakage. When it comes to unconventionals is quite difficult, is different, let's say, because you're working with not several large wells, but you're working with truly thousands and thousands of small wells. And so you're comparing several of these from a conventional sense, several large wells and large potential sources of emission, if it's not properly being operated, to thousands and thousands of smaller wells from lots of smaller companies in general. And some of the aerial surveys are not able to pick up necessarily on the smaller level of methane that could be leaking from some of these smaller sources. So in general, we focus a bit more on the flaring side, on conventionals, where there's quite good data that comes from the World Bank, and we're currently doing a series of investigations into how much methane may be leaking as a result of poor flaring practices or overestimations of how efficient the flares are.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca. Very enlightening. So we give you we still have a bit of time if you have more questions, and again, if you want to raise your hand and speak up, that's also possible. Okay, maybe as you might write more questions, just reminding you that tomorrow, same time, so 9 a.m. 9 a.m. Lusaka time, we'll have a next session done by not IEA experts, but a partner university coming from Imperial College. So Mr. Mark Owells and colleagues will present how they do long-term energy modeling. They will discuss energy access and geospatial analysis. They will also discuss socioeconomic projections as an input and in the framework of long-term energy modeling. So that will be an interesting, I think, session. And also, you will be able to ask any question you have on energy modeling in general, because it will be also presenting different approaches and different tools as what we do to the IEA, even though it's very consistent with our methodologies and approach. So we have one more question. Yanda Amilemba asking us to explain regions A, B, C, and D. I'm not sure. This might relate to the slide on trade. Rebecca, can you see the slide? On the refining model, I think when we calculate regional trade balances for crude oil and oil balances.
Right. I think yes, absolutely. I can see the slide. So thank you, Yanda, for the question. On this particular slide, the example is pulled up here that the regions are not specific in that they don't refer to a real region. It's a cartoon to exemplify how the trade would potentially move about. And so I just want to differentiate, if I may, whether the question is asking if region A, B, C, and D are real regions, in which case the answer would be no, it's purely for more of a cartoon, or if the question is more in depth in terms of definitions for or assumptions around regional demand, refining capacity, or crude oil output.
Okay, it looks like it was a understanding that the regions were hypothetical and illustrative. Okay, we can still take 3-5 minutes if there are more questions.
So very happy to answer any questions as well that come up later, or questions on the exercises as you work through those, or come across any questions. We also do appreciate the feedback on the exercises, of course, so that that others that follow you can understand them better as well, and also on the slides and the content. And so if you do have any feedback, please let myself or Arno know so that we can adjust for those that come after you and try to make this the best experience, the best learning experience that we can.
Yeah, exactly. And that we know that within this audience, there are not so many people working directly on oil and gas, but you might have a different area of expertise in the energy sector. But this course and this presentation is about sharing the basis of all the sectors. So yeah, any feedback that would help us make it clearer for people who might or might not have a background on the oil and gas sector would be highly appreciated. Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I'd like to thank you, Rebecca, for your time and for your answers, and thank all the participants for your attention and for giving us your time this morning. Again, we'll meet tomorrow 9 a.m. And I wish you a very good day, and thank you again for your time.
No, thank you, and enjoy the training.
Bye bye.